The year was 1934, a Christmas meant to be one of joy and togetherness, though for me it was anything but. I had spent the past decade far from the Wren family estate, away from the stifling gloom that seemed to cling to our ancestral manor. My father's death 2 years prior had left my mother a brittle shell of herself, her once radiant warmth dulled into a brittle politeness that barely masked her sorrow. Still, I had returned for her sake, hoping to salvage some semblance of familial cheer. The house, an imposing structure of gray stone and darkened gables, was nestled deep in the English countryside. Snow covered the surrounding fields, the pale glow of moonlight washing over the skeletal trees. Inside, the great hall was festooned with garlands of holly and flickering candles, their fragile light casting flickering shadows against the high, vaulted ceiling. Yet, despite the festive decorations, there was a chill in the air, one that no roaring fire could banish. That night, as my siblings and I prepared for dinner, a sharp knock at the front door echoed through the hall. We rarely had visitors, especially not in weather as foul as this. My mother, ever the gracious hostess, insisted we answer it. Standing on the threshold was a figure cloaked in shadows. He was tall and gaunt, his face as pale as the snow behind him. His eyes, set deep beneath heavy brows, glinted with an intensity that made me uneasy. He introduced himself as Mr. Dorian Ashmore, claiming to have been an acquaintance of my late father. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying the faintest hint of amusement, as though he were privy to some secret the rest of us could not comprehend. Though my mother hesitated for only a moment, propriety won out, and she invited him inside. Ashmore stepped across the threshold, his black cane tapping against the stone floor, and I felt the temperature drop, an imperceptible shiver running through me. As the servant set another place at the long dining table, I studied our unexpected guest. His clothes were immaculate yet old-fashioned, his movements deliberate and unsettlingly smooth. His smile, when he spoke, revealed teeth that seemed just a shade too sharp. Yet no one else seemed to share my unease. My mother, eager to entertain, pressed him with polite questions to which he offered vague yet charming answers. The storm outside grew fiercer as the hour advanced, the wind howling like a beast prowling just beyond the walls. And though I could not yet place why, I began to feel that we were not alone, as though some unseen presence lingered just out of sight. The dining hall was a tableau of Christmas excess. The table was laden with platters of roasted meats, glistening vegetables, and steaming puddings. Candles burned in silver candelabras, their flickering flames casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls. The air was thick with the mingling scents of spices, pine, and roasted chestnuts, a combination that should have been comforting. Instead, it felt cloying, oppressive, as though it sought to smother rather than soothe. The family gathered around, raising glasses of mulled wine as my mother gave a toast. Ashmore, seated at the head of the table, smiled faintly, lifting his glass without drinking. It was a small gesture, easily missed, yet it struck me as strange. I was the first to notice the change. My first bite of turkey, so perfectly golden and crisp, tasted wrong, dry and flavorless, as though all the joy had been leached from it. The gravy, thick and aromatic, burned my throat with its bitterness. I glanced around the table. My sister Emma's smile faltered as she set her fork down, her face pale. My brother Marcus chewed slowly, a crease forming between his brows. My mother, always composed, hesitated before taking another bite. Only Ashmore seemed unaffected, his plate untouched, his sharp eyes flitting between us. "Is something the matter?" he asked, his tone mockingly polite. The words sent a shiver down my spine. There was something in his gaze, a gleeful malice that he no longer bothered to hide. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, Emma gasped, clutching her chest. The room erupted into chaos. Emma collapsed, her face white as snow, her breaths shallow and labored. Marcus doubled over, his face twisted in pain. My mother stood, calling for help, but her voice cracked with panic. I looked to Ashmore, who remained calm, his hands folded on the table, watching us with a faint, satisfied smile. "What have you done?" I demanded, my voice breaking. Ashmore leaned back, the dim candlelight casting his face in shadow. "What I've done," he said slowly, "is ensure that old debts are repaid." The room seemed to darken as he spoke, the shadows deepening and twisting unnaturally. The fire in the hearth sputtered, its warmth all but gone. My heart raced as he explained. The feast had been cursed, each bite laced with a hex that drew us closer to death. His words struck like a blow, the horror of it sinking in as I looked at Emma's pale, trembling form. And yet, his tone carried no malice, only cold satisfaction. I stood, determined to confront him, but as I took a step forward, the room swam before my eyes. A deep, mocking laughter echoed through the hall. Ashmore raised his glass once more, toasting silently as the rest of us fought to breathe. The dining hall seemed to warp as Ashmore's words settled over us, his cold laughter echoing like a dirge. The once familiar space felt alien now, its grandeur twisted by some unseen force. Shadows, impossibly long and sinuous, writhed along the walls as if alive. The fire sputtered again, casting only faint, flickering light, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. Emma lay slumped in her chair, her breaths shallow and ragged. Marcus had collapsed onto the floor, clutching his stomach as he groaned in agony. My mother, pale and trembling, hovered over Emma, her hands fluttering helplessly, as though trying to conjure some solution out of thin air. "You speak in riddles," I shouted, my voice breaking with panic and anger. "What is this debt you claim? What are you doing to us?" Ashmore regarded me with an unnerving calm, his pale eyes glinting with amusement. "Ah, Nathaniel," he said, his voice low and even. "It is not what I am doing, but what has already been done. Your father, a man of insatiable greed, destroyed lives without a second thought. Mine was one of them. He reduced my family to ruin, drove us from our home, and left us to starve. And so, I found alternative means to redress his sins." He gestured around the table. "Tonight you feast not on the bounty of this earth, but on the fruits of your father's transgressions. Every bite you've taken binds you to the curse. Every taste draws you closer to the reckoning." A cold dread clawed at my chest. My father had been a ruthless businessman. That much was true. But I had never imagined the depths of his cruelty, or the consequences it might bring. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound resolute. "If it's revenge, take it out on me. Spare my family." Ashmore tilted his head as if considering the offer. "You misunderstand," he said with a faint smile. "This isn't about want. This is about balance. What was taken must be returned, life for life, soul for soul." The room swayed and I stumbled, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. My head throbbed, and my vision blurred at the edges. I could feel it now. The curse, coiling inside me, sapping my strength with every passing moment. "However," Ashmore continued, his voice taking on a mockingly generous tone, "there is a way to break the curse. It requires courage, sacrifice." He leaned forward, his sharp features cast in stark relief by the flickering candlelight. In the attic of this manor lies an old mirror. Within it resides the spirit of the one wronged by your father, my ancestor, Tobias Ashmore. Face him, and perhaps he will show mercy. And if he doesn't? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then, Ashmore said, standing and retrieving his cane, you will find out what it means to owe a debt that cannot be repaid. The attic door loomed at the end of the hallway, its wooden frame warped with age. The air here was colder, the chill seeping into my bones. Behind me, the manor was unnervingly silent, as if holding its breath. I carried a lantern, its weak glow barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. Each step I took up the narrow staircase creaked loud enough to echo, the sound reminding me of distant wailing. My breathing quickened as I reached the attic door, its iron handle icy to the touch. Inside, the attic was a cavernous void, cluttered with forgotten relics of the past. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the air smelled of dust and decay. The faint beam of my lantern caught the surface of the mirror, standing tall and foreboding against the far wall. Its frame was ornate, carved with grotesque faces that seemed to twist and sneer as I approached. The glass was impossibly dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the mirror rippled like water, and a cold wind rushed through the attic, extinguishing the lantern's flame. Darkness enveloped me, and I froze, paralyzed by fear. Then, a face emerged in the mirror. Gaunt and skeletal, its eyes burned with a malevolent light. The spirit of Tobias Ashmore stepped forward, his spectral form half submerged in the glass. "So," he rasped, his voice like the scraping of nails on stone. "The blood of Edmund Wren returns to face judgment. Do you seek forgiveness for his sins?" My voice faltered. "I seek to save my family." The spirit's laughter was a jagged, broken sound. "Your family? They carry his guilt, as do you. To save them, you must offer me a piece of yourself, a piece of your soul." The room seemed to spin, the shadows deepening and twisting around me. "And if I refuse?" I whispered. The spirit's smile widened, his teeth glinting like shards of ice. "Then you will all perish as my family did. Forgotten, unmourned." Terror surged through me, but so did resolve. I thought of Emma, her fragile form barely clinging to life, of Marcus pale and gasping, of my mother's tear-streaked face. I couldn't let them die. Swallowing my fear, I stepped closer to the mirror. "Take it," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my limbs. "Take what you need." The spirit lunged forward, his cold hand plunging into my chest. Pain unlike anything I'd ever known ripped through me, and I screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness. My vision blurred, and the world around me dissolved into shadow. When I awoke, the mirror was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor. The lantern flickered weakly beside me, its light barely enough to illuminate the room. Tobias Ashmore was gone, but I knew I had paid the price. Something vital within me was missing, a hollow ache that would never be filled. I staggered back down the stairs, my legs weak and unsteady. The house was silent, but the oppressive weight that had hung over it was gone. As I entered the dining hall, I found my family stirring, color returning to their faces. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. In the corner of the room, leaning against the wall, was Ashmore's black cane, a silent reminder that some debts are never truly repaid. The silence in the dining hall was deafening as I entered, my footsteps muffled against the thick Persian rug. My family had begun to stir, their groans breaking the stillness. Emma, pale but alive, sat upright, her trembling hand reaching for my mother, who had sunk to her knees beside her. Marcus, leaning heavily against a chair, wiped the sweat from his brow, his breaths uneven but steady. Relief flooded their faces as they saw me, though my vision blurred as exhaustion and an unbearable weight pressed on my chest. You did it, my mother whispered, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. She rose unsteadily, her hand brushing against my arm, but I could not bring myself to respond. The room felt strange now, as though something vital had been stripped away. The air was lighter, yes, but it carried a peculiar stillness, a void left behind by the departure of the curse. My gaze fell to the head of the table where Ashmore had sat. The chair was empty, the plate before it untouched, yet his presence lingered like an echo in my mind. Then I saw it. The black cane, leaning casually against the wall as though forgotten. Its twisted handle seemed to gleam in the dim candlelight, the grotesque carvings along its shaft appearing almost alive. I shuddered, my instincts screaming that Ashmore's departure was far from final. I tried to step away, but my legs buckled, and I sank into a chair. That hollow ache inside me, where the spirit's hand had reached, grew heavier with every breath. It wasn't physical pain, but a gnawing emptiness, as if Tobias Ashmore had taken more than he'd claimed. Nathaniel? Emma's voice, weak but insistent, drew my attention. What happened? What did you do? I met her gaze, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain? How could I tell them that to save them, I'd given away a piece of my soul? Before I could answer, the clock in the hall struck midnight, its chime resonating unnaturally loud. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure reflected in the shards of the broken mirror I had carried with me. Tobias Ashmore's gaunt, spectral face stared back, his lips curling into a thin, knowing smile. The horror was far from over.